Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the US and the Holocaust post-premiere panel discussion. My name is Alexa Delosier with WQED, and I'd first like to thank the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh for partnering with us to host this event, as well as WIDA, Baldwin Whitehall School District, and PBS. There will be a Q&A session after the panel discussion. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please utilize the Q&A function. I'd now like to introduce our panelists for the evening. First, Lauren Bairnsfather, Ph.D., Director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. While writing her senior honors thesis at the University of Texas, she became acquainted with two Sephardic Holocaust survivors. Inspired by these women, she took an internship in the photo archives of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and quickly became full-time staff. She earned an MA at the University of Chicago and a Ph.D. at the University of Texas. In July 2015, after working in Dallas and Austin, Lauren returned home to Southwestern PA to become head of the Holocaust Center. She's an Adjunct Professor of History at Chatham University and has been invited to lecture at Baylor University, University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon University, and the University of South Carolina. Barbara Burston, Ph.D., has been on the history faculty of both Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh for many years. At the current time, she is teaching at Pitt and Chatham University as well. Her many classes have included the US and the Holocaust, Pride and Prejudice in American History, and the History of Pittsburgh. She has recently published a graphic booklet entitled America and the Holocaust, targeted particularly for junior and senior high school students. In addition, she has written 5 books, including After the Holocaust, The Migration of Polish Jews and Christians to Pittsburgh, Steel City Jews, 1840 to 1915, Steel City Jews in Prosperity, Depression and War, 1915 to 1950, and Sophie, the Incomparable Mayor Maslow. She has also served on the Pittsburgh Human Relations Commission and assumed leadership roles in other local nonprofits. She has led teaching training workshops, spoken extensively in the community, and taught a number of wide-ranging courses for both the CMU and Pitt Osher senior citizen programs. Rebecca Erbelding, has been a historian, curator, and archivist at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum since 2003 and has served as the lead historian on the museum's special exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust. She holds a Ph.D. in American History from George Mason University and is the author of Rescue Board, The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe, Doubleday 2018, which won the National Jewish Book Award for Excellence in Writing based on archival research. She and her work are featured in the 2022 PBS documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein, a film for which she served as a historical advisor. John Spurlock, Ph.D., Professor of History Emeritus, Seton Hill University. Dr. Spurlock has been involved in Holocaust education since the 1980s, when he was teaching high school in his home city, Riverside, California. At Seton Hill University, he was a member of one of the first faculty groups to study the Holocaust at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. In collaboration with the Yad Vashem archivist, he helped graduate certificate in Genocide and Holocaust Studies and served as coordinator of the program for several years. Since 2012, he has taught courses on World War II, comparative genocide, and theories of genocide. In 2022, he served as co-director of Grappling with Genocide, an NEH-funded summer institution for middle and high school teachers. I now turn it over to our moderator for the evening, Daniel Shaner, teacher in the Baldwin Whitehall School District.
Thank you very much. I'd like to get right into it. We have several questions, and I imagine our audience will have many as well. Dr. Erbelding, I'm going to start with you. We're thrilled to have you with us this evening, and I'd like to ask my first question. Can you please take us through the steps that you went through in creating the documentary and what doing so meant to you?
Sure. So it was a complete honor to work on this documentary. And I think one of the things that you do when you work on something like this is you try not to imagine people watching it. And so now millions of people have watched this film, and I've been so relieved and honored and pleased with the way that so many people have engaged with it so deeply. So the story for me started really in 2015. The museum that I work at, we'll get there. The museum that I work at was working on an exhibit on Americans in the Holocaust. We were just starting out, and one of my colleagues knew the filmmakers and approached them with the idea of, wouldn't this story make a great film? I mean, we were kind of building the exhibit at the same time that we were pitching this as a potentially really good story for them. And they agreed. And they were working on the Vietnam film. And so that gave us time to really build the exhibit and figure out the story and do a lot of the research. So when they came back to us in 2018 and said, okay, we're ready to go, the museum had an agreement with them. And then the filmmakers asked me if, in my private capacity as a scholar, if I would work with them kind of as a second job. And so the interview that I gave them for the film was actually done in the fall of 2018. So it's 4 years old. That's how long they had been working on it. And they really started with doing a bunch of interviews, coming up with a draft script, and then figuring out where the holes are, where the gaps are, where we need more and different voices, where we need a survivor to really help us understand this story. And so I was part of that process, looking at the drafts, trying to help them advise, you're missing this story, and this is a really key thing that needs to be here. Or I really disagree with your characterization of this. Can I show you some documents that maybe shed some more light on that? And they were incredibly receptive the entire time that we worked together. And I'm really proud of the film. It was a really long process, as you can imagine, lots of debates, lots of discussion about specific words. Is this the right word? The maps, oh my gosh, the maps are so complicated, because what name do you use for towns that changed borders 5 times over the course of the war? What do you call it? How do you make it something that people would understand if you're showing 10 seconds of this map? Lots of debates, lots of discussion, and they were so receptive to hearing from historians. They were so smart about it. It was just a real thrill to work on as a historian, and is definitely going to be one of the highlights of my career.
I can only speak for one man, but I found it an amazing experience. So I've actually got to watch it all twice now, thanks to PBS Media. So it was very meaningful. Okay, to our entire distinguished panel, the first question, it seems like the obvious one. Having viewed all 3 episodes of the documentary, what are your overall impressions of what you have seen?
I'm gonna jump in. I see Barbara, you're saying something, but you're gonna need to unmute. So maybe I'll go first, and then I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you.
So my overall impressions were that I was really familiar with the content, including the photographs. You heard that I worked in the photo archives at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, so I was anticipating what we were going to see. Nevertheless, it was put together in a way that made it very new to me. So as I watched each episode, I was thinking about things in a different way. It was challenging me to look at materials I know very well and see them in a different light. So I think it's very important in that way for challenging even people who have a lot of knowledge of this to think about it in a different way.
And I was very much looking to see whether it was going to be fair and balanced, if I can put those two together. Because the tendency has really been to try and sensationalize things, to try to really shock and criticize America and Franklin Roosevelt. I'm looking at 2 letters that were just published in the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, one by Raphael Medoff and the other one by Professor Monty Penkower. Medoff I've seen over the years, who is always looking for an opportunity to criticize Roosevelt, and I find it unfair and not really addressing the context in which decisions were made. So I was afraid, frankly, that the Ken Burns film might fall into that that follow that path of trying to sensationalize and really make us look terrible. And I thought it did not do that. I thought that it was, as I said, fair and attempted to present the difficulties that we faced and the obstacles in the way and the hard decisions that had to be made. And so I was really impressed with the film, and I felt the survivor testimony absolutely was so powerful and illuminated the narrative. The photos and the films was material I hadn't seen. Not that I've seen a lot, but I've certainly have seen quite a bit in my years of teaching. And so I just thought it was a really brilliant effort that I would be proud to show in classes and to have people look at. And that is a real contribution to this study of this subject.
I just want to second what both Lauren and Barbara have said. The production values, of course, are very high, but what I found so compelling were the individual stories, the specific stories. Some of them heartbreaking, some of them heartwarming, but in every case, those stories really brought home so much of the so much of the real stakes for individuals in this. And very interesting, very clever that Ken Burns begins with the Anne Frank's family, and somebody we kind of know, or many of us kind of know, but then draws in these other people, the survivor testimonies, as Barbara was mentioning. And I thought it was brilliantly done, but it was also I thought very, very moving.
Okay, was there anything presented in the just over 6-hour documentary that surprised you?
I thought it really conveyed a lot of. I thought it really conveyed a lot of the major events properly. So I wasn't surprised. I was surprised in some of the, as I say, the survivor testimony that you were able to tap, and the film footage that only illuminated and amplified on the stories. But it follows the themes of America's response to the Holocaust through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Lauren, did you how did you feel about that? Lauren, you're muted now.
We need each other, as always.
Yeah.
Thank you. One thing that I really thought a lot about afterward was how we need to have the Holocaust in the public eye. We need to, because people feel like the story of the Holocaust is a long time ago. It's not relevant anymore. I hear this every day. And in order to tell the story of the US and the Holocaust, we really needed to hear the story of the Holocaust.
Whoops.
It was so painful to watch in its like excruciating detail, and the photographs that were used. I mean, just unflinching look at the reality of the Holocaust, and we needed it.
Rebecca, yeah.
I was going to say, it's interesting that you say so, Lauren, because there was a big debate, I think, about some of the use of the footage.
Mm-hmm.
Because I felt at the beginning that this is too graphic. This is too hard. You're really going to put this on TV for people to see on a Monday night. To see mass killing like this is not something that people are ready for. And the filmmakers were very, very clear that no, people need to see this. People have not seen this. You've seen it. You know it. People need to see it. And I think they were right about that. To me, the thing that this film brought out, I think better than anything I've seen, is the interplay between the war and the Holocaust. It's something that's such a struggle to untangle, is this the Nazi goals, how the Nazi goals of racial anti-Semitism and territorial aggression butted up against each other. And I think the film does a really good job of showing how the Nazi expansion really enabled the Holocaust to happen. And it's done through really clever use of maps, amazing film footage, and Jeffrey Ward's script, which is absolutely incredible and the exact right word at the exact right moment. And so I feel like it's an incredible teaching tool for that as well.
You know, what's interesting is the linkage. You know, most people would think about the Holocaust, but they wouldn't link America to it at all. And, you know, now that I think about it, I'm wondering whether people began to understand that what we did or didn't do, and I'm not just talking about we America, but the Allies, impacted on Hitler's thinking and the unfolding events in Europe. And so now that I think about that, maybe that wasn't made more clear, that there is a linkage, there is a connection between America's response and America's policies, et cetera, and what ultimately happened. We weren't responsible for the Holocaust, obviously, that was perpetrated overseas, but do we have any, on a ladder of responsibility, do we have any responsibility for what happened? And certainly, when we think about it, the issue of refugees is one that immediately is so tied into everything. And of course, we really, you know, we didn't do a whole lot, although, as we find out, America did more than anybody else. But, you know, that's where that's one linkage that could be explored more. But there are others as well.
Barbara just gave me the perfect segue to my next question. So thank you, Barbara. Conversely, as talking about what surprised us being included, was there anything that was omitted that you had hoped that you would see?
I have an answer to that, because there's someone I admire so much who was part of this story and she wasn't in it, and that's Ruth Gruber. And she is in the exhibit that was referred to earlier. She was involved in bringing the refugees to Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York, and she was an incredible journalist, way ahead of her time. There are films about her, and I knew her when I was in my early 20s, and she had such an immense impact on my life's trajectory. So I was waiting, we're going to see Ruth, and she wasn't there. And related to that is toward the end, I wanted to see more about the discussions about the survivors and the displaced persons, and more about how the world dealt with that. And I know that then we're in the aftermath, which is in and of itself a really worthwhile topic. And so I'm guilty of watching this as a historian and thinking, why aren't they saying the things I want to say? But I think that it really opens the door to talk more about a couple of things that happened after the war that really didn't fit into the scope of the 3 episodes.
Well, beyond Ruth Gruber, there are other, you know, like Dorothy Thompson, there are others who certainly spoke up. They did mention Varian, maybe I'm pronouncing it, Varian Fry, who was a rescuer. Were there other American rescuers, other American journalists who were instrumental in trying to really bring this topic out to the American public? You know, so maybe there could have been more highlighting of some of those key Americans. But, you know, Rebecca, you know, I mean, how much time?
You can't talk about everything. I know.
Yeah. I made a whole list for them of these are all the things that are not mentioned. But that list could have gone on and on and on, right?
What was your list?
My list included Martha and Waitstill Sharp, which Ken, of course, knew because Ken Burns had also produced a film about Martha and Waitstill Sharp, who were 2 Unitarians who worked in Prague in 1939 and then in southern France in 1940 and 1941 or 1940. So that was a story that they knew, and I kind of made the list just to make sure that we were all okay that these these figures were not here and this story was not here. I mean, I'm also guilty of having watched this film 30 times. So when you mentioned Dorothy Thompson, I was like, she's in episode 1, Barbara.
Is
She's
she
there.
really?
I promise. I wouldn't have let them do it without Dorothy
I
Thompson.
only watched it once, so I
No,
missed.
it's fair. I've watched it 20 times now. But Ruth Gruber is not there. That Lauren's absolutely right. Ruth Gruber is not there. Fort Ontario has about 3 minutes. I mean, this is one of the challenges is like, when you say what's not there, another 3 hours is what's not there. You know, all of the sentences have books that could be written about just this topic contained in that one sentence. Right. And so what I really want to come out of this documentary is for people to say, oh, there is a viable field of study here. There are so many topics. I have a Rolodex of topics for anybody working on a dissertation to say, this is something that nobody's explored yet. Please take it. I want to read your book. I want to sit on a conference panel with you. We need more people working on this topic. And I hope that this film is a way to get people to engage with this as a viable and interesting field of study. So that's what's missing to me is like another 4 hours to really like get into all of the things that that we could have gotten into or explored even further.
True.
I can say as a public school teacher for 30 years, I very strongly support your idea that this is a field of study that needs to be covered. This should be dealt with in the public schools. And thankfully, in Pennsylvania, it's becoming more and more common, and I'm very happy about that. Okay. My next question.
That's a question I have. Is the teaching of the Holocaust, let alone the teaching of America in the Holocaust, becoming more pervasive, or is it are schools not teaching the Holocaust because it's making students uncomfortable, or it's a tough topic? So I'm inclined to think that there's less teaching on the Holocaust than more teaching on the Holocaust. So I could be wrong on that, but that's my feeling.
Well, several states now are requiring it, which is very good news. Is that enough? No, but it's a start. And I can't retire until we get more. So it's going to keep going until we do it well.
Yeah, and it's hard to respond to that from where I'm sitting, and probably also from where John's sitting, having done this incredible 2-week program with teachers in the summer. So, I mean, we're engaging with teachers all the time. We know that we can do more, but what we see happening in schools that we're working with now is like really deep study, much deeper than it's been in the past, well beyond what we saw happening in schools before. And this documentary can play an important role in that.
I think the enthusiasm is there among teachers. I'm seeing it anyway. And I think there is a revision in how it was taught, at least from when I was in school, that it's not necessarily getting to the end of the war and then now we'll talk about the Holocaust for a couple of days. And I think and I hope that this film will help teachers think about how to weave it in, because if you look at state standards, most states talk about the Great Depression, they talk about isolationism, they talk about war weariness and neutrality, and those are all key factors in looking at American response to the Holocaust. And so I hope this film kind of allows teachers to think and play with how to integrate the study of the Holocaust throughout their study of the 20s and the 30s, rather than kind of keep it as its own special chapter.
Hope you're right.
For sure.
And having survived John's class this summer, that NEH seminar that we're talking about, and Lauren was part of that as well, I can say that the students that were there, the teachers that took this class, we're still in contact on a daily basis. And I'm in Pittsburgh, there's another person from Pittsburgh, but there are people in Oregon and California and across the country, and we're still communicating, and we're still very fired up. I love that, and I want to see it grow.
Yeah, 20 rock star teachers for 2 weeks. It was a great experience for all of us.
My next question for me, and this is a scene from episode 3, we were talking about Anne Frank, and there is a part of it where Anne Frank's famous quote of, "After all of this, I still believe that people are basically good at heart." And one woman speaking said that she wondered if that would have changed if Anne had been allowed to keep her diary after they were captured, and had Anne taken that diary to the camps with her. And I thought that was especially poignant because I never considered that part. And were there any moments in the story that particularly resonated with any of you?
Everything resonated.
I've not managed to see the film without crying when Joe Hilsenrath sees the Statue of Liberty in the second episode.
Yeah.
And part of it is what he says about how he realized, and he was 10 or 11 when he came, that he wouldn't be killed and that he would get to live to grow old. And I've thought about this before, of course. I work with Holocaust survivors on a daily basis, but the reminder that even small kids were afraid of being killed on a daily basis, and that coming to the US relieved them of that burden for the first time, is something I think is really striking. And I'm glad he said it so that people could hear him say it.
And then for me, it was, well, again, getting back to the interviews with the survivors, which were so extraordinary, but thinking about the separated families and, someone in the United States hoping that against all odds, their family members survived in Europe was just, it's always just excruciating to hear those stories and to hear them told by the person who experienced it is, these are important things for us to know about and to understand how human beings experience that when we think about families being separated under circumstances.
The survivors who spoke were incredibly articulate. There was no, it was direct, it was powerful, it was inspiring. It was just, they were incredible interviews that really crystallized feelings and made us live this experience with them. That's not always the case. You can interview many survivors and it just, you're just not getting them to articulate emotion and feelings the way you might want. And these survivors, of course, their stories were incredible, but they were able to articulate them as well.
One of the things that resonated for me was the bureaucracy of American immigration, and people standing in line for hours day after day, people filling out forms, and then they're just, it seems like they're going to have a way to leave wherever they are in France or Germany, that their visa expires or something. It's something that simple that meant life or death to a lot of people. Some consular official somewhere being a little more generous, or unfortunately, in most cases, just deciding they're gonna toe the line. If I had hair, I'd be tearing it out looking at the documentary. I thought that was done actually extraordinarily well.
Which I think raises questions for us today. Certainly, that's one of the questions that comes out of it, that you can't help but think about the plight of refugees and how we respond to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, I think my next question starts to build off of that. The abuses that were aimed at the German Jewish people and other groups that the Nazis targeted were both shocking and rapid in their implementation, but they also built up gradually between 1933 and 1938. At what point do you think the outside world, particularly the United States, could no longer feign ignorance of what was happening? And at what point do you think we should have taken a stand against the Nazis' actions? And as a further part, what stand could we have taken?
How long is this program?
I think we need to unpack what you mean by what was happening. Because if you're talking about an eventual genocide, that's not clear until I think after 1938. And I think this period that you're talking about, 1933 to 38, is the period in which so much more was possible to have to do. It becomes very, very difficult after the war begins, particularly after Pearl Harbor. But the US has a lot of information. They have journalists like Dorothy Thompson on the ground in Europe, reporting firsthand what they're seeing on the streets of Germany in 1933. And so Americans have a lot of information. You know, the opening of Dachau in the spring of 1933 is covered in the New York Times. And so this information is available, but what they know is that things are going badly, that Germany has an anti-Semitic government that is putting forth anti-Semitic laws. That's why I think Holocaust scholars talk so much about early warning signs, because that is the moment in which it is still possible to change the trajectory. It becomes very, very difficult after genocide begins.
I would question really how much the press covered this. And of course, newspapers really were the main mode of communication. I've had students who I've had look up the response, for instance, to the April boycott against Jewish businesses and even to the St. Louis. And most newspapers, yeah, they might have a story about it, but that story would not necessarily be on the front page. It might be a very small story. It would not necessarily indicate the desperation of the people on board the St. Louis, for instance. So it might have been covered, but you still have the question of whether it really resonated and whether the American public was really interested in news from overseas when they're faced with a depression and hard times and they're struggling themselves. And frankly, they're looking for their own families, their own security, and they cannot necessarily have an openness to the plight of others. You know, today it's so with the Russians, the Ukrainians, it's in our face. We're bombarded with this news. We see the destruction. We see the plight of these refugees. But you didn't see any of that in the 1930s. Did people really care, frankly, about Jews? Because when and that is mentioned in the film, that the level of anti-Semitism in this country is at an all-time high, and people simply are not that interested in events overseas, and they're certainly not interested in events that pertain to Jews. So I don't know how much, when you say it was covered, maybe, but did the coverage really provoke much of a response, a sympathetic response on the part of Americans? Public opinion polls certainly indicate that it did not.
I mean,
and I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, there was a moment in the documentary when Daniel Mendelsohn was speaking and talking about people he's interviewed, people who were victims, who were in Poland or Ukraine, and saying that they themselves couldn't believe that this was happening, even though that here it was happening. And he went on, how much more people who are removed from it. So I think there is a kind of the Holocaust, and Rebecca in her book makes a good point. Americans don't have that term. They don't have that word. They don't have the word genocide. They don't have a framework to fit this into. But it is so large. It's so horrific. It's even late in the war, the estimates were underestimates of how many had been murdered. So there was information, but I think that there was a big gap between the information available and the actual knowledge that people took from that.
I think, but you're talking about the 40s now, and I think that's a slightly different animal than the 30s. The 40s, clearly, there was not much coverage, and newspaper, like the New York Times, books that have been written about it, that the New York Times did not really highlight the war against the Jews as distinct from just the war itself in Europe. There was not that much coverage of it. And of course, you run into the issue of believability, which is huge. How often do we say when something terrible happens, we say, I can't believe it. And that certainly applied to all kinds of populations in Europe, including the Jewish population and others as well. So that's another whole discussion about coverage in the 40s and believability versus coverage in the 30s and how much people really cared. And
who that coverage is coming from in the 40s. It's coming, especially the first reports are coming from the Soviet Union and from the Polish government in exile, which are news sources that many Americans do not trust.
Right.
Because they're thinking they're trying to get us into the war. In terms of the 30s, I think it ebbs and flows. Right. There's a fairly large response in 1933 with this first wave of persecution. I mean, it's the largest protest march in New York City history is on May 10th, 1933, specifically about book burning. And there are marches and rallies in over 65 cities. But as you pointed out, Americans have a short attention span. They go back to thinking about the Great Depression and doubling down on neutrality. And so it doesn't result in anything. That's a failure of imagination. It's a question about hindsight. We know now that this should have been an extended protest. And it's also, I think, a really interesting and relevant question about the role of the press. Like, is it the press's job to push a story that they feel is important? Or are they responding to what their readers want to read? And if their readers are not interested in the fate of a Jewish community in Germany, why would they put that on the front page? It's the question of clicks now. If we don't click on it, then the press won't continue to print that kind of story. And they will do that even when there's a genocide happening. It's a business. And so we got to talk. I think that's a relevant question too.
And I think that's a question that is one that comes out of this that we can ask today. About the kind of where do we get what our facts are? They facts, and how are events covered? Do we know about them? And just the whole issue of our education, our awareness of what's going on in the world today is there was concern. Obviously, the press was major in the 1930s and 40s in terms of how people got their information. And what about today when people just have a screen and a few clicks and that's all their information? Is that where we want to be?
Barbara has an excellent book on the United States and the Holocaust that is designed for middle and high school education. And in that book, she mentions the 1936 Olympics. And by that point, the Nazi excesses had to be obvious to even the most casual of observers. Now, the oppression of the Jewish people may have been hidden, and they may have been able to pull that off, but the treatment of African-American athletes. Jesse Owens is the most famous, but we're from Pittsburgh. There was an athlete from the University of Pittsburgh who grew up less than an hour from here, who was also part of that, who's an African-American who competed there.
And I wanted to know that the students at the University of Pittsburgh didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Which is very unfortunate.
Now they know.
Well,
hopefully they do now, yes. Okay, my next question, if we're ready to move on. The actions of the Nazi Party had a large impact on the formation of the United Nations, as well as other large international groups such as NATO. What powers do such groups have to rein in the abuses of member countries and non-member countries, if any?
I actually feel like the documentary helps us understand the push and pull, the pressures that make it so difficult to respond, even if all of us are sitting home and wanting a response. And I know that when we had our preview event before the documentary aired, Dan, who is Holocaust Educator of the Year, by the way, who didn't really take any credit for his accomplishments in this field, you brought up the last Olympic Games. So, I mean, we had a bit of a back and forth on how can a government respond, how can the United Nations respond, understanding that there are all of these factors that complicate taking action. So I felt like I learned a lot from the documentary by seeing the example from the Holocaust and what the United States could and couldn't do.
I would like to take that on a more individual basis, okay? Because I don't want people to think that, oh, these forces are beyond my control and I can't really do anything. I think that this study of America and the Holocaust and the film really pushes us to think about what is our responsibility as citizens of this country. And I think this era, I mean, that's why I teach this course. I've been teaching it for many years. To me, it's important to learn about these events because this is our history and we need to understand. But the imperative there is that we need to get involved in our political system. We need to know who our leaders are. We need to exercise our vote. We need to be responsible citizens to make sure that the country is on a course that we would like to see it on. And of course, you know, we're not talking about the comparison here between Hitler and Roosevelt, but this is the era where you have these two men who represent diametrically opposed regimes, and one, supports a democracy given this depression and everything that he's facing, the crisis he's facing, and the other one takes his republic down in flames. And so to me, it's so crucial. And that's what I tried to do in this booklet that I have, that I've produced for high school and junior high school students, to have them really come out of this study with a better understanding and an appreciation for what they need to do as individuals to protect democracy and to get involved in causes that they feel are very important. So I don't want anybody coming away from this film, and I'm sure that's not Ken Burns's objective either, to think, oh, we can't really do anything, this is beyond us. I think really Burns and the material really pushes us to think about our responsibilities as citizens.
I would never say that we don't have power and things that we can do as individuals. Of course we can. I think that for many of us, we may look at our international organizations and feel a level of frustration, even with so much support going into Ukraine now. And there's a Jewish president there, which to me is like the most miraculous thing that could have happened in Ukraine when we know the history of what happened to the Jews there. Nevertheless, yes, as individuals, there is a lot that we can do, and it certainly is what we teach. But I think it's also important to know the limits of establishment around the world. So, I mean, we need to understand the big picture when we're deciding how we can act. And one more thing I'll add is that Father Patrick Dubois, when he was here in 2016, a student who was very frustrated, as there were things that student wanted to do and they felt like they couldn't have the impact that they wanted to have. His advice was act at your level. And we all have things that we can do at our level, right? And we can grow that level to do even more.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency, and I know I feel it myself sometimes, of frustration that I can't fix this. But I personally cannot stop the war in Ukraine, but I can write a letter. I can keep reading about it. I can donate a little bit of money. Like, I think that's what you're saying, Lauren, is act at your level. And when you look back at this history, I think there's also a frustration where people say, well, it was so clear to know what to do. And I don't know what to do now. It's way too complicated. And I think one of the things that to me, as someone who studies this and that the film brings out, is that it was really complicated back then to know what to do too. But there were still people who chose to act. And we need to look at those people and then think, how can I do these things in my life now? Sponsor someone. Again, donate money, write a letter, vote, for goodness sake, on causes you care about. There are things that we can do as individuals that together will add up.
And I think even beyond what I was saying, what you're saying about responsibilities as citizens, so much of this age was an age of bigotry and prejudice. And we have all faced situations where people have either inadvertently or deliberately said something that is really, anti-Semitic or racist or whatever. And, there wasn't enough pushback in the 1930s with that kind of attitude, but we can do it now. And I think I'm always looking for things that come out of this experience, this history, and certainly the necessity on a personal level to confront bigotry is one of those imperatives that we can all, at our level, as you say, respond to. Stop bullies, stop bigots, at least confront them or tell them that, it's not really a nice thing to say.
An unfortunately famous American just this week actually was on Twitter claimed that he was doing DEFCON 3 on all Jewish people. And it was Kanye West. Yay. I'm not sure what you want to call him. And many people in the entertainment community have spoken out against it, which is a good first step. So that's what one person can do, is start speaking out every time it happens. That's what I teach my children, that we don't stand up sometimes. We have to stand up every time. And that's very important. We have been told by WQED that our time is up. I was afraid we would not have enough questions. We have way too many questions. We now have questions coming in.
Can I just mention
Yes.
this?
Show that book, please.
We're going into Q&A anyway.
Pardon?
We're going to have a Q&A, but please.
This is a booklet that was done with an accompanying teacher's guide for junior and high school students. And if you are interested in seeing it, I would be happy to send it out to you. Just go to the website, www.americaandtheholocaust.com, and we can be in touch.
Okay, this is our first question coming from the audience, and it's fairly long. Two separate thoughts. I did not realize how America treated Native Americans and Japanese had such an influence on Hitler's thoughts. Also, how Americans chose specific countries to close immigration to certain immigration to certain European countries far prior to the war. Can you speak to this and how it relates to anti-Semitism today? So, in a nutshell, how did Hitler base his racial purity thoughts on what was happening in America? And then how did America's immigration policies affect anti-Semitism then and today?
Well, I can talk about the first part, which was, I wouldn't say that Hitler is influenced by the United States. Hitler is pleased with the United States. Hitler sees the United States as doing the right thing, as acting to create a more racially pure country. And so the actions that the United States is taking with the Chinese Exclusion Act, with the Gentleman's Agreement with the Japanese, and then with restricting immigration in 1921 and 1924, Hitler sees as the United States trying to move towards a white Protestant racially pure nation. And he is very pleased with that, not only because he sees that as kind of what he would like to do eventually with Germany, but also it makes it harder for the United States to point to Germany later. This is one thing that comes up in 1933 when the State Department is trying to decide whether to protest what the Nazis are doing. There is a fear that the Nazis will just turn around and say, well, look at the South. This is Jim Crow America. How dare you talk about what we are doing to Jews when this is what's happening in the United States? And so I don't think Hitler is necessarily inspired. I think that this would have happened anyway. He doesn't get his anti-Semitism from the US, but the well of kind of racial science ideas, the well of prejudice, it is coming from the same place and then manifesting in different ways in a totalitarian state and in a democracy separately.
But the lawyers who crafted the Nuremberg laws in 1935 clearly examined the racial laws that we had in this country against intermarriage and any kind of, against Blacks in this country. So they absolutely did model their legislation on legislation that we had that was clearly racist against Blacks.
They modeled it, but we didn't give them that idea. They would have gotten there anyway. They would have figured out
that might be true, but
yeah.
They did.
Totally right.
The other exchange of ideas that comes out in the first episode of the documentary is the exchange of sort of eugenicist theories, which was so appalling because these were people who were like leaders in industry and cared about the environment. And that was one thing in the documentary that really had me like just shaking my head. So that those kinds of theories did cross the Atlantic. The idea of, certain racial ideas, certain races are better than others, certain people are not fit to reproduce, all kinds of really troubling things that were happening in both the United States and in Europe and happened in the Holocaust.
Well, maybe to wrap this up, but going back to the Native American example, there's a point in the documentary where they quote Hitler saying that the Vistula will be our Mississippi, the idea that invading the East is going to be the equivalent of the American expansion into the West. And that very much is the case. The ideology is that all of these places in the East are open to us because they're inhabited by, a wild, savage people. And again, I don't think Hitler had to read Karl May and his popular Westerns to get that, but that certainly was a way in which those ideas were built up and reinforced.
All right, we can go to our second question from the audience. What do you think of Darrell Horn's argument that Holocaust education tends to make anything short of attempted genocide seem relatively unimportant?
Is that what she says? I'm not sure.
I can honestly say I have never seen that quote before, but I'm going to trust the audience member.
I thought she had something that kind of said that people like to read about dead Jews.
Yeah, that's what her book is. I think, but what do I think of that idea, if indeed that's the argument? I think this really misrepresents what Holocaust education does. And you have a lot of Holocaust educators on this panel right now, and Holocaust education does a whole lot more than, create a hierarchy of suffering. What we're actually doing is using history to help students understand what's happening around them now. And the history of the Holocaust has such depth. We can learn so much about human behavior. And it goes well beyond anything that would ever say that anything short of attempted genocide is relatively unimportant. Think of rescuers, think of survival, resistance, all of the things that we teach when we teach about the Holocaust.
I know that anybody that I know that teaches the Holocaust, the words never again are used quite often in that unit, that we are not trying to relegate any other suffering to a level of unimportance. We want to stop all suffering. And the Holocaust is one of our fields in which we go to do that. Next question is more of a statement to be commented upon, and it's fairly long. While there are many states that have Holocaust education recommended, there are only 18 states which require Holocaust education. Here in Arizona, Holocaust education mandate was just signed recently. The crux of the matter is whether there is any oversight over what is being taught and what is being learned. And I believe that the Diary of Anne Frank might be giving 2 generations now of young middle schoolers a very limited knowledge of the Holocaust.
That's probably true if that's all that's taught.
I'm glad people are watching from Arizona. Hi.
I know, isn't that
Pretty
cool?
I mean, I see the Diary of Anne Frank as a way to get interested in learning more about the Holocaust. I think it was an entry point for a lot of people, including me, because Anne is such an engaging writer. And so if that's all it is, then I would agree that there's a lot of Holocaust experience missing. You can't learn about the Holocaust through one person's story. It is such a big thing that you need multiple voices and multiple experiences. And I think what the comment about oversight and what people are learning and what's being taught is something that is currently being worked out on a state-by-state level. I think each state has its own challenges and debates about that. And there hasn't been enough time and study to figure out, what is really working well and what could be used as a model for other states.
I just want to add very quickly that there are actually, I think, even more than 18 states now that have mandates. And just a few years ago, there were 9. So this is something that's really building up momentum across the country. There is a real effort to get mandates passed in all 50 states that Holocaust education is mandatory.
And the resources for that education are expanding all the time. The US Museum, US Holocaust Memorial Museum is producing just fabulous resources for that, facing history. Obviously teachers are always struggling. I mean, it's one of the 3 professions that's impossible to do. But I do think there's more support for it as time goes on.
I want to mention that our booklet here on America and the Holocaust is going to be on the PBS website, right, Dan? Because yes. Dan's writing a teacher's guide with that as well. So please consult that. We're trying to get that on. We have consent. They want to get it on. So we have to, we're moving on that.
I can answer this question from the point of view of a public school teacher. And excuse me, I was a fully adequate teacher for most of my career. And in 2015, I met a remarkable woman at a conference. And one of the things that I learned in that conference is that Anne Frank is a very good part of a Holocaust education unit. But it is only one part, and it is not sufficient in and of itself. Dr. Bairsfather taught me that at a teacher seminar on Holocaust education, and I can use Anne Frank in a middle school classroom, and I can use other sources like Salvage Pages, which are other diaries written by other teenagers at the same time. But even then, I have to start well before that with historical anti-Semitism, then anti-Semitism as it led to Hitler's attempt to rise and Hitler's eventual rise, and then what came after Hitler's rise, and then what has come since the war. So Anne Frank is one part of a puzzle. It's an important part of a puzzle for middle schoolers, but it's certainly not the entire puzzle. All right, this next question, I believe, is probably more of a Rebecca question than the rest of us, simply because she was there. And it is, were the survivor interviews conducted several years ago or within the past 4 years?
They were all within the past 4 years. I think most of them were 2019 and 2020.
How did you find these people? I mean,
Susan Warsinger is a volunteer at the Holocaust Museum. She shares her story there. Guy Stern has written a book. Saul Messenger, I'm not sure how they found Saul Messenger, who talked about the St. Louis. And so a variety of places.
All right, I have one more question here. I appreciated watching the film elaborate on the link between paper walls and the U.S. Immigration Act, part of which is the Asian Inclusion Act as well. Do you know of any other historical films or curricula that explore this topic in more detail?
which topic in more detail? American the Holocaust? Is that?
I think the immigration restrictions in the United States, immigration policy in the United States.
That's the way I'm reading it, is immigration, not just for Jewish people during this period, but they included the Asian Exclusion Act as part of that as well.
So about this period, the Holocaust Museum in DC has a lesson plan called Challenges of Escape, which is specifically about how immigration worked, and there are lots of resources that are linked to that. There were also a number of lesson plans and curricula created regarding the film that are on PBS Learning Media, including one about refugee experiences that use clips from the film to help students understand and talk through the challenges that refugees were facing at the time, both legally and personally.
Background reading, the book Barbarian Virtues by Matthew Fry Jacobson. It really gives an extraordinary account of racial and ethnic ideas, late 19th, early 20th century, that then becomes the milieu in which all of these other things are taking place.
Okay, that's the last of our questions. And I think it was Rebecca who said earlier that we could go forever on this topic, and we probably could if we allowed ourselves to. It's now after 8 o'clock. I'm asking any of the panelists, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share? Anything that you want to make sure that you have? And Barbara, include that. I would put out that email address again. That's part of this.
www.americaandtheholocaust, all one word, .com. And if you're an educator, I could send you the booklet at cost, and you could peruse it and see what you think, if you could use it in your classroom. I deliberately, I did it as a graphic, I call it a graphic booklet. I can't call it a comic book because it's not funny. So I came up with this notion of a graphic booklet, and I have two students who discuss the events as they're unfolding. And so their reflections on it, and this presentation as a graphic booklet, I hope will appeal to students and be where they are, because I don't know about you, but I'm finding it difficult to have students really read books and so forth. And this is a way to make this subject matter more attractive to young people. And I know Lauren has seen it and really appreciated it. So anyway, I wanted to call it to your attention. And Dan's doing some lesson plan on it. And we have another lesson plan too, that Classrooms Without Borders produced. So we have some good material.
And beyond that, I appreciate you, Barbara, and everything that you've done to be sure that people have been learning about this subject for decades, that it was so innovative of you.
Really decades too, you know.
Well, at least a couple of years, right? That it was that you understood how important it was to introduce students to this subject and understand the American context, because it's too easy to feel like that happened in Europe. And important things were happening in the United States. And that's why I hope everybody sees this documentary And my concluding thought will just be what an honor and a pleasure it's been to be on this panel with all of you, and just an incredible follow-up conversation. So if we have a chance to do like the next documentary that will include Ruth Gruber and your whole Rolodex of themes, I would be happy at least to talk about it after it's finished, or anything between now and then.
And let me plug Rebecca's book, The War Refugee Board, which really was an amazing contribution that the United States finally got around to. Oh, great, get the book, show it. Terrific. Because the War Refugee Board really was a humanitarian response that we really undertook in a very serious way. It's true, not till 1944, but at least tens of thousands of people were saved by the efforts of Americans, and we absolutely needed to note that. And of course, the film does recognize that. So I think that's important to highlight. And I'm so glad Rebecca did that.
Thank you so much for having me.
As a practicing teacher, my best advice I can give to other teachers out there, no matter where you are, copy down the names under these people that you see in front of you. And if you have questions, these people are the experts. These are where I turn whenever I have questions. And I often have way too many. And they have been tremendous friends for years, and they have been a lot of help, and they've helped a tremendous number of teachers. We are finished for tonight. I would like to thank everyone for attending. I'd like to thank my panelists especially. And those of you in the audience, thank you. And please keep learning and teaching about the Holocaust.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.